Okay, so as I'm sure you probably know by now, I love talking about virtual tabletops or VTTs on this channel. It's a big topic of discussion for me, and all of the cool automation possibilities, immersion opportunities, and all of the great quality of life changes that they bring to your table and or virtual table if you're playing it entirely online. And while they are great, and I truly think that there are tons of benefits to using virtual tabletops, whether it be to kind of augment your physical sessions or to provide as much immersion as possible with your entirely online sessions, it's not all sunshine and rainbows with using them, and that's kind of what I want to talk about, because there are definitely some cons to using virtual tabletops and things that players and game masters don't like about using them. So like, for example, virtual tabletops can sometimes be very difficult and time consuming to learn, and sometimes players and game masters alike can even be more distracted or interested in what's going on in their second monitor, or perhaps what the current new TikTok trend is, rather than the actual game session that's currently happening. And I've also experienced that sometimes VTTs can even hinder the creativity of players. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because in this video, I'm going to be talking about all the cons specifically to using virtual tabletops and using them to run your game sessions entirely online. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of this video, I want to say that while there are definite downsides to using virtual tabletops for your game sessions, and they will most likely never truly replace the electricity that fills the air of a physical game session, there are definite pros that, in my opinion, completely and drastically outweigh the cons to using virtual tabletops. So if you want to see me make a video talking about what players and game masters love about virtual tabletops, then let me know by leaving a like and a comment down below. But anyways, hello everybody, my name is Damon, and I've been using virtual tabletops for years at this point to run my game sessions professionally, both physically and entirely online. And in this video, I want to start off by talking about the first con to using virtual tabletops, which is just learning how to use the dang things. As I've mentioned in other videos, the world of virtual tabletops is ever expanding, and there are constantly more and more virtual tabletops being released that each have their own ups and downs, and if you're not super experienced with using VTTs, the learning curve that you have to go through in order to proficiently use some of them to run your game sessions can be pretty steep. But obviously this is a case by case, not all virtual tabletops are created equal, and some are super difficult to learn, and others are very simplistic. And what I mean by learn basically boils down to the basics of running a game session virtually. Those basics being, how do you set up your game system of choice and everything that's associated with that? How do you set up ambience in the form of art and music? And finally, how do you find and import battle maps, setting up walls, tokens, vision, lighting, and stuff like that? In my experience and humble opinion, these things are the most basic items that you need to know how to do in order to adequately use a VTT to augment your physical game sessions, or to use them to run your game sessions entirely online. And while it may not seem like a lot, if it's your first time using and learning how to use a virtual tabletop, sometimes this can be very time consuming depending upon the virtual tabletop you're using, and requires a lot of either reading on the wiki or watching how-to YouTube videos, if that makes sense. And what I mean by this is you have to learn the layout of all the tools, how to use those said tools, and then learn how to get your assets into the VTT, and then properly set them up or link them to tokens, and then give your token permissions to the players, and then get the players onto the battle map, and then how they interact with the battle map and other players and monsters and yada yada yada. It's just such a big hassle sometimes, especially if you're brand new to VTTs and getting familiar with how this process works. So basically this point just kind of boils down to learning how to use a virtual tabletop adequately can be very time consuming and have a very steep learning curve. And then on top of that, if you want to use a very powerful VTT like Tailspire or Foundry, for example, which allow mods, then if you throw mods into the mix and then third-party hosting services, sometimes issues arise and you have to know how to fix those issues and then manage your mods and all the other kind of stuff, and it can get very complicated very quickly if you're not too careful and don't take things gradually. But moving on to probably the most important part of any game session, which isn't the prep phase, but just getting your players into the game session. And for some of you seasoned VTT veterans out there who are perhaps watching this video with a skeptical eye and beginning to write in the comments at this point is ridiculous, because players traditionally have had a very easy time connecting to game sessions on the VTT, and traditionally game masters have been the only person that's been required to purchase a software license to a VTT or a subscription or whatever, which is true, don't get me wrong. But one trend that we're slowly beginning to see kind of develop in the virtual tabletop space is that the game master is no longer the only person who has to purchase a software license anymore. Like in cases with RPG Stories or Tailspire, the players also have to purchase a version of this VTT in order to actually join a game session. Because with some VTTs at least, your sessions are generally hosted on the game master's network, meaning that if you don't have a good connection and you're running for a large group, then things can get pretty laggy pretty quickly, especially if you have roommates or family that are also using the internet, or if you have a big battle map with animations, lighting, sound effects, and all that cool stuff. It can just be a really big toll on your internet connection. But what if you don't have a good or reliable internet connection, or perhaps just don't want people directly connecting to your network? then you'll most likely be forced to and will have to subscribe to a third-party hosting service just for you to have a secure connection and for your friends to be able to have a smooth connection to your game sessions. And like I mentioned, not all VTTs have this issue, of course, because with VTTs like Roll20, for example, you generally don't have to worry about connection issues because your sessions have dedicated hosting, but that also means that if Roll20's or your third-party host's servers go down, then that will most likely mean no session for you that week. And additionally, I'm pretty sure that making an account with Roll20 is still free, which you may think is the best option because you can use that free account to run game sessions, but the Game Master will still most likely need to purchase one of the paid subscription packages if they want to keep a reasonable amount of assets on Roll20 and gain access to some locked features and stuff like that, which is kind of how they get you. So while initially you may think that running a game session online is as easy as getting a VTT, hosting yourself, and then getting your friends together and then running the session, in my experience, there's always little if, ands, and buts. Like, for example, if you have a friend who lives in a different country, it may be easier for you to get a third-party hosting service who has a server between you guys, so that way the connection is better overall for everyone in the game session. Or if you're running for a very large group, would it be easier to just use a VTT that has dedicated hosting, so that way you're not tanking your own internet connection? Like, there's always little caveats and complications in my experience at least. But let's say you don't experience any of these issues, right? And you're able to seamlessly get your friends together, get a VTT, and then run your game sessions online, and you've been doing this for a couple of weeks at this point. Well, then you may begin noticing some problems or some issues or potential issues that you've never experienced before and you couldn't have possibly foreseen. And this point doesn't necessarily apply to every group, obviously, but one thing that I've experienced and noticed, and one thing that other game masters who I've talked to who have run their game sessions online have noticed, is that there is a gradual, if not almost instant, departure from using physical items for your game sessions, such as character sheets, dice towers, dice, game master screens, and stuff like that. Because obviously, if you can just do all that virtually and it's automatic and so forth, then why use the physical ones? And like I said, this of course depends on the group dynamic, but one thing that I've noticed with my sessions is that while players and game masters may start out rolling physically and doing everything in a traditional way, when using a VTT that has a lot of automation options and mods like Foundry, for example, you slowly begin foregoing physical rolls and character sheets in favor of virtual ones, because the virtual ones are simply a lot more and sometimes completely automated and take care of a lot of that pesky number crunching and sometimes very tedious dice rolling that can suck up a lot of time in a physical game session. Plus, if your players don't have a webcam or like a dice cam or something so that way everyone else at the table can see their expressions or the dice they just rolled or so forth, it can really take away from the experience, in my opinion. And with most virtual tabletops, when a player rolls virtually, the dice shows up for everyone else as well, which can be pretty cool because you don't always get to clearly see the dice outcome when you're playing in person. So because of this, I've found that when using a virtual tabletop, players tend to save physical rolls for the very crucial moments like death saves or final blows to a boss or something like that, because they feel like they're cheating everyone else out of the experience of not being able to see the dice roll or their expressions, or they feel like they're slowing down combat if they roll physically, or they want to roll virtually so that way no one feels like they're cheating, which can be a legitimate concern if you're playing entirely online. And there have definitely been times when I've reminded my players like, hey guys, you know that you can roll physically, right? We'll just have to use honor rolls, but you can if you want to, and they will still choose to roll virtually over physically, which is pretty interesting. But if you also run your sessions using virtual tabletops, what's your experience with rolling dice? Do you or does your group exclusively use the virtual dice for the sake of simplicity, quickness, and automation? Or do you still like rolling physically because of the feel of the dice in your hands and seeing it flip over to a natural 20 in person? Or do you kind of do a mix of the both? I'm actually really curious to hear what your guys' experiences are. But moving on, you notice this issue and you address it. You tell your players, guys, this is ridiculous. We need to use our physical dice more. These virtual dice are corrupting our minds. And then your players are like, okay, cool. Yeah, we can do that. I don't really care. And then you're like, oh, well, actually, I don't care either. And you move on. So you continue running your sessions as you always have, and everything's fine and dandy for a little bit. But then you begin to notice something else. Your players have seemingly stopped coming up with very creative solutions to encounters, and some of them almost altogether stopped asking for descriptions of scenes and battle maps. Why? Why? This, at least in my opinion, is caused because of players becoming too fixated on what a visual aid looks like or what a battle map looks like, depending upon how detailed it is. Since we're running our sessions virtually, as a game master, we tend to and want to give our players the most immersive experience possible since we can't run our sessions physically. So we try to find artwork that we can show to our players when they're traversing through the wilderness that kind of fits our image, and maybe provide some music or sound effects to add to the ambience. Or additionally, find animated backgrounds or battle maps to really add immersion to the scene, which is great, don't get me wrong, but sometimes this actually hinders the traditional theater of mind method that many game masters and TTRPGs rely on to provide immersion to their players, because sometimes players can fixate on an image and overthink it a little too much and begin to ask questions like, wait, who's that? Wait, what's that? Crap, it's running at us! I cast Fireball! Die, you unholy abomination! And then you have to hastily explain that the monster's not actually there and the person's not actually there. You just thought that the forest looked the way that you were envisioning and you were trying to set the mood, and maybe it wasn't the best idea, and yada yada yada. You get the point. Additionally, when it comes to combat encounters and battle maps, there are a lot of super high quality battle maps out there that can really add a lot of immersion to your combat scenes, which isn't inherently a bad thing, don't get me wrong. But because of how detailed some of these maps are, if there are weapons, cool looking glowy thingies, or other details on the map that aren't actually there in the scene that you're trying to describe or create, it can lead to some awkward moments. Like, for example, if a player tries to interact with something that's portrayed on the battle map but isn't actually there in the room that you described, then you have to explain, sorry, that thing isn't actually there that you're trying to interact with because you just picked the best battle map that you could find that fit the room that you were going for, and so forth. Or if you describe the room slightly differently to how it's portrayed by saying something like, the ground is littered with bones, or the floor is partially flooded, and the battle map doesn't depict that, then it can lead to some confusion. This can lead to players, again, fixating on what they see before them and forgetting described details about the room or scene because it's not immediately apparent when they look at the artwork or the battle map. And after hearing this, you may be thinking, well, my players would not immediately disregard my description of a room, especially if I made it a point to describe a very strangely colored wall in this room that may not be depicted on the battle map, but since I described it, it's there. And the players wouldn't immediately disregard that, would they? Especially after I took 5 minutes to describe the entire room. And while that may be true in your case, in my experience, this happens more often than you'd think, because when you're running your game sessions online using a virtual tabletop, then common in-person house rules like no cell phones at the table or no distractions that can ruin immersion for the other players and make sure they can pay attention and stuff like that don't really apply, or at least you can't really enforce them easily, because after all, you and your players are sitting at the computer where you could easily open up another tab, or maybe begin playing a game on another screen, or just pull out your phone and start scrolling through TikTok or playing a game, and for the most part, no one would be the wiser, especially if you don't use a webcam. And this is where the issue arises, because in my experience, it is a much greater battle trying to maintain player attention and immersion if you're running your game sessions virtually as opposed to physically. Because if you're around a physical table, you can kind of snap your fingers at someone and say like, hey, pay attention. This is literally pertinent to everyone and you could die based off your decision. You should pay attention right now. But then if it's virtual and they're not using webcam or whatever, then it's a lot more difficult to do that in my experience. Because as I'm sure you probably know, people play TTRPGs for various reasons. Some people like the role-playing aspect of it, some people like the combat aspect of it, and some people just like to be loot goblins and go around and cause chaos. Like, you know what I mean? Everyone plays it for different reasons. So if the thing that makes that player want to be there doesn't really happen all that often in the session, especially when you're playing virtually, they can really clock out pretty often in my experience. And so because of this, if an encounter is happening that interests one part of the group but doesn't really interest the other, then most likely the disinterested part of the group will just pull out their phone, open up a new tab to cool math games, or just boot up Steam and start playing a whole new game entirely until something interesting to them happens, or it's their turn in combat or whatever. And then when something happens that demands all of the players' input or attention, it can be like pulling teeth sometimes to get everyone to focus back into what's actually happening in the game, and can sometimes lead to the game master having to describe the last 10 minutes of what was just discussed or what just happened and so forth. And of course, this can be remedied with very extreme rules, such as your webcam has to constantly be on, or you have to constantly be engaging in roleplay with someone or an NPC or something, otherwise you get kicked out of the session. But in my opinion, that's a bit extreme, especially for someone who's just sitting at their computer, most likely in their pajamas, just playing D&D, like, you know what I mean? And speaking of extreme, depending on what kind of VTT you're using, sometimes they can demand a lot of processing power from your PC. Meaning that if you want to run a game for 6 players on a 3D VTT, and you want to create massive maps that players can explore, complete with animations, sound effects, automated traps, and so forth, that might mean that one of your players with a low-end PC won't be able to play because of how much processing power that demands. And in my experience, while I haven't come across this issue nearly as much as these other problems and cons that I've kind of mentioned, it is still an issue and it is still worth mentioning. So in conclusion, if you want to use virtual tabletops and you want to know the quick TLDR of all of the downsides to using virtual tabletops, these are basically what all of the issues boil down to. Number 1, learning how to use a VTT can be very time consuming. Number 2, figuring out how to host your sessions can be very challenging, especially if you don't have a good internet connection and don't want to pay for a third-party host. Number 3, physical interaction with dice, character sheets, and other things like that is drastically reduced in my experience, especially when it comes to interacting with other players if you're playing entirely online. Number 4, maintaining player attention and mitigating distractions for the sake of immersion can be very difficult to do, especially if your players are easily distracted and don't really care about what's currently happening in the session and would rather be doing or playing something else. And then finally, number 5, hardware limitations. reasons, because obviously, if you're trying to join a 3D virtual tabletop game session on your Toshiba laptop from 2006, it probably won't work out very well for you, I'm just gonna be honest. But those were my honest opinions and biggest downsides and perhaps reasons why players and game masters don't like using virtual tabletops that I've experienced over the past decade of using VTTs to run my game sessions both physically and online. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, consider leaving a like and a comment down below in regards to some of the points I talked about in this video, and perhaps your experiences with using virtual tabletops. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I hope to see you in the next one. Take it easy. Bye-bye.